They dragged her chair onto the lunch table in front of 200 cadets. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She just stood there, steady as concrete, and looked out across the dining hall like she was memorizing every single face. Nobody understood what that look meant. Not yet. 3 hours later, those same cadets would be bleeding in the dirt, pinned down by enemy fire, screaming into dead radios. And the only person standing between them and a body bag would be the woman in the white chef's jacket. They thought was good for nothing but washing dishes. Her name was Lena Voss. They called her the kitchen girl. They had no idea what she used to be called. If this kind of story gets your blood moving, subscribe to the channel right now. Hit the like button, drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Don't miss what comes next, because it only gets more intense from here. The alarm in Lena Voss's quarters went off at 4:45 in the morning, same as it always did. She didn't groan. She didn't hit snooze. She sat up in the dark, swung her legs over the edge of the narrow bed, and sat still for exactly 30 seconds. An old habit. The kind you didn't pick up chopping carrots. The room was barely bigger than a supply closet, which was fitting since it was located 2 doors down from one. A single cot, a footlocker, a small desk bolted to the wall. No personal photographs. No decorations. One shelf above the desk held 3 books, a dog-eared paperback on military nutrition, a thick volume on high-altitude terrain survival, and a spiral notebook she kept locked with a combination she'd never written down. She pulled on her uniform, white chef's jacket, dark trousers, non-slip boots, and tied her blonde hair back with a plain elastic band. No mirror check. She already knew what she looked like, unremarkable, forgettable, exactly the way she'd planned it. Ironvale Military Academy sat 40 miles from the nearest town, carved into a valley between 2 mountain ridges in a part of the country where the winters came early and the cell signal was non-existent. It was the kind of place that produced either exceptional soldiers or exceptional failures, with very little gray area in between. The campus was austere, stone buildings, narrow corridors, parade grounds that turned to mud the moment it rained, which was most of the time. The cadets trained hard here, she'd give them that, but hard training didn't automatically produce good judgment. The kitchen at Ironvale ran from 5 in the morning until 8 at night, 3 full meal services plus snack prep for the long training days. Lena had been assigned there 7 weeks ago, brought in through a civilian contractor to replace the previous cook, who'd retired after 22 years without anyone bothering to throw him a going-away party. Nobody had asked Lena many questions during intake. She had a food handler's certification, a clean background check, at least the version of it that existed on paper, and she showed up on time. That was enough. The head kitchen supervisor, a heavy-set man named Gerald Pruitt, who wore reading glasses on a chain around his neck and talked too loud about his golf handicap, had assigned her to breakfast prep and vegetable processing. Lena did what she was told. She chopped, she stirred, she portioned, she kept her station clean and her mouth shut. The cadets barely noticed her. That suited her fine. By 6:15 that morning, the first cadets were filtering into the dining hall for morning chow. Ironvale ran on a rotating schedule, with different cadet companies eating at staggered times to avoid congestion. First through the door on Tuesdays was Alpha Company, the Academy's top-ranked unit, the cadets with the highest assessment scores, the best physical performance numbers, and a collectively inflated sense of their own importance that was visible from across the room. Lena worked the serving line without looking up. She knew their voices by now. 7 weeks was long enough to learn a lot about people when they thought you were furniture. 2 eggs, no yolk. A tray slid in front of her. She scooped the eggs without comment. You gave Martinez 3 strips of bacon yesterday. I counted. I only got 2. She looked up for the first time. The cadet in front of her was tall, early 20s, with a jaw that looked like it had been designed for recruitment posters. His name tape read Cross. He wore his rank insignia with the practiced ease of someone who'd been told his whole life that authority suited him. Captain Adrian Cross. Top of his class 2 years running, son of a decorated general. The kind of person who had never once in his life been told to wait his turn. Lena placed a 3rd strip of bacon on his tray. Thank you, he said, not like he meant it. She went back to the eggs. The incident that morning started, like most things at Ironvale, as nothing. The Alpha Company cadets clustered at 2 long tables near the center of the dining hall, the prime real estate, closest to the windows, farthest from the kitchen smell. A position they'd claimed by unspoken consensus the first week of the semester and defended ever since. Cross sat at the head of the table, the way he always did, and the conversation that morning was tactical. They were working through a field exercise scenario, a simulated assault on a fortified position across broken terrain. The exercise was scheduled for the following week, and Cross was already treating it like a personal audition. Lena was wiping down the serving counter when she heard it. "We hit the North Ridge first," Cross was saying, moving a salt shaker across the table to represent a unit position. "Draw their attention. Secondary team flanks east, takes the high ground, controls the sight lines." "The east approach has a drainage channel," said a cadet named Whitfield, second in command, quieter than Cross but sharper. 2, maybe 3 meters wide. We'd lose time on the crossing. "We manage the crossing. It's not a factor." "It becomes a factor if we're taking fire during the approach." "We won't be, because the North team has already engaged them by then." Lena didn't plan to speak. She was 3 meters away, back half-turned, and had made a genuine effort not to think too hard about what she was overhearing. She'd gotten good at that. But the error was the kind that bothered her the way a splinter bothers a finger. Small, specific, impossible to ignore. She set down her cloth and said quietly, "The North Ridge approach puts your first element in a dead ground depression for about 40 meters before they can establish contact. No elevation advantage. If the defending force has even basic observation posts on that ridge, your lead element gets flagged before they're in range to suppress anything." The table went quiet. Heads turned. Cross looked at her the way you look at a house cat that's just started speaking. "I'm sorry," he said. "Did you just—" "The drainage channel on the east approach is a problem, but it's a solvable problem," Lena continued, because she'd already opened the door and there was no useful reason to stop. "Pre-position your crossing equipment. Send a 2-person advance team to mark the breach point the night before. The east flank works. The North Ridge approach has a geometry problem that equipment can't fix." Silence. Then Cross smiled. It was a slow smile, the kind that preceded something unpleasant. "A cook," he said, "giving tactical advice." The table erupted. Not just laughter, the performative, braying kind that exists specifically to establish a social hierarchy. Cadets 2 tables over turned to look. Someone in the back made a comment Lena didn't fully catch but understood the shape of. She picked up her cloth and went back to wiping the counter. Her expression didn't change, but her jaw had tightened just slightly, and she turned so her back was to the room because she was better at controlling her face when nobody was looking at it. Cross decided that a verbal humiliation wasn't sufficient. Lena learned this around noon when she came out of the walk-in cooler carrying a full sheet tray of prepped vegetables and found approximately 60 cadets gathered in the dining hall outside of normal meal hours. Not gathered randomly. Arranged. Like an audience. She stopped. Her eyes moved across the room. She clocked the exits. 2 main doors, 1 service entrance to her left, 1 window bank along the south wall that were regulation height but probably negotiable in an emergency. She counted the cadets who were standing close to the walls versus the ones bunched toward the center. She noted who was holding what. All of it happened in about 4 seconds and registered nowhere on her face. Cross was standing beside the long central table. He had his arms crossed and the expression of someone who had decided they were about to be very entertaining. "We've been thinking," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "that since our cook wants to weigh in on tactics, maybe she deserves a better vantage point." 2 of his cadets, Reyes and a broad-shouldered one she knew as Garfield, stepped forward and took hold of her chair. Not her. Just the chair, for now. They lifted it onto the table. The room cheered. "Go ahead," Cross said, gesturing up. "Elevated position. Better sight lines. Your words." Lena set the sheet tray down on the counter with precise care. She didn't slam it. She placed it. She walked to the table. She climbed up. The room cheered louder. Someone wolf whistled. Cross was already grinning at his audience, working it, making sure everyone got a good look at what happened when you tried to correct your betters. Lena stood on the table. She looked out across the room, and she did the thing that nobody expected. She took her time. She wasn't searching for an escape. She wasn't performing calm. She was doing exactly what it looked like, methodically cataloging the room. Every face, every position, every detail. 22 cadets near the east wall, 14 at the back. Cross directly below her and slightly left, instinctively positioning himself where he had the clearest view of her humiliation but the least awareness of his own flanks. Whitfield near the door, arms crossed, not laughing, watching, which was different. The table vibrated under her feet. Someone below was thumping it rhythmically. The noise was substantial. Lena let them have 30 seconds of it. Then she looked directly at Cross and said, calmly enough that the people near the back had to quiet down to hear her, "You want to know the difference between a person who knows how to fight and a person who knows how to win?" Cross raised an eyebrow, still amused. "Enlighten us." "A person who knows how to fight puts themselves in the best position to inflict damage. A person who knows how to win puts themselves in the best position to control the outcome." She looked around the room once more. "You put me on the table so everyone could see me. You didn't think about what I could see from up here." Cross opened his mouth. She climbed down before he could answer, picked up her sheet tray, walked back to the kitchen. The room was not as loud as it had been. The rest of that day was ordinary, in the way that days are ordinary when everyone involved has decided to pretend something didn't happen. Lena prepped dinner service. She cut 3 kilos of onions without her eyes watering, a fact Gerald Pruitt noticed and attributed incorrectly to experience with commercial kitchen ventilation. She portioned chicken, calibrated the industrial oven, and spent 40 minutes after close down scrubbing the grill surface because the second shift worker had left it in a condition that would have failed any reasonable inspection. She went back to her room at 8:30. She sat at her desk and opened the spiral notebook. She didn't write anything for a long time, just sat with her pen in her hand and stared at the last entry, which was dated 6 days ago and consisted mostly of brief, almost telegraphic notes. Weather observations, personnel changes, supply delivery discrepancies she'd cataloged purely out of habit because her brain refused to stop noticing things even when she'd specifically asked it to. There was one line at the bottom of that entry that she'd written and then read back to herself and nearly crossed out. "They're not ready." She didn't cross it out. She closed the notebook and locked it. Colonel Vivian Hale ran Iron Vale's Tactical Training Division and had been doing so for 11 years. She was 53, lean and angular, with close-cropped silver hair and the deliberate economy of movement that came from spending 2 decades in environments where unnecessary motion got people killed. She had been awarded the Distinguished Service Medal twice and never displayed either of them in her office. She had noticed Lena Voss on day 3. Not because anyone flagged her, not because anything obvious happened. It was smaller than that, the kind of thing you only see if you've spent enough time training yourself to look for it. She'd been crossing the courtyard when she saw Lena coming from the supply depot, carrying 2 heavy equipment cases, one in each hand. The weight was significant. Hale estimated 30 kilos minimum per case. Most people carrying that load showed it in their shoulders, in their gait, in the slight forward lean that redistributed the strain. Lena's posture was completely neutral. She wasn't compensating. She was carrying the weight the way someone carries weight when their body already knows how. Hale had slowed, watched her cross this courtyard and move toward the kitchen service entrance. Watched her pause, briefly, barely a half second, at the corner of the building, where the angle of approach from the main gate created a natural blind spot. The pause was reflexive, unconscious, the kind of check you stop noticing you're doing after years of practice because it becomes as automatic as breathing. Lena went through the door. Hale stood in the courtyard for a moment longer. Interesting, she thought, and filed it in the part of her brain reserved for things that didn't have an explanation yet. Over the following 3 weeks, Hale watched when she could without being obvious about it. She noted, Lena always sat with her back to a wall during the brief overlap periods when staff ate in the dining hall. She positioned herself near windows, always the window that provided the widest external field of view, never the ones that looked into internal courtyards. When deliveries arrived, she counted the vehicles without appearing to count them, the way someone counts without moving their lips. When there were strangers on campus, inspectors, visiting officers, contractor personnel, her awareness shifted, became fractionally more precise, in a way that was invisible unless you knew what subtle heightened alertness looked like in a person who had learned to mask it. None of this was proof of anything. It was the kind of observation that, in another context, might have been the beginning of a conversation. Hale hadn't started that conversation yet. She was by nature and by training patient. She was also, and she acknowledged this to herself without particular drama, curious in a way she hadn't been curious about a person in quite some time. Well, the live fire exercise that Thursday was supposed to be routine. Iron Veil ran field exercises periodically throughout the semester, graduated in complexity as the academic year progressed. This one was a standard perimeter defense scenario, conducted at the Academy's remote training base 8 kilometers into the mountain terrain, a cluster of prefabricated structures surrounded by dense pine forest, with a perimeter fence, vehicle access roads, and enough room to run a realistic multi-element engagement with reduced charge ammunition and training-grade pyrotechnics. 2 platoons of cadets deployed to the base on Wednesday evening to establish the defensive position. A 3rd platoon, including Alpha Company, including Cross, was assigned as the attacking force, scheduled to begin their assault at 0600 Thursday morning. Lena had been assigned to support the base's field kitchen, which meant she was already on site when everything started going wrong. She'd been there since Tuesday, brought in a day early to prep for the extended field rations, and she'd spent her extra time the way she always spent extra time, quietly, doing her job, and noticing things. She noticed the communications antenna on the southeast corner of the main structure had a mounting bracket that had been installed backward, a detail that wouldn't affect routine transmissions, but would degrade signal under sustained use or in wet conditions. She mentioned it to the staff sergeant responsible for comms. He thanked her politely in the tone of someone who was not going to act on the information. She noticed the secondary generator was low on fuel. She refilled it herself. She noticed the eastern tree line was 300 meters closer to the perimeter than the training documentation indicated, which meant the marked safe standoff distances on the field maps were wrong. She didn't mention that one to anyone. There wasn't an obvious person to mention it to, and she told herself it wasn't her business. That was a decision she'd revisit later, in the sharp, unpleasant way you revisit the decisions that turned out to matter. The attack began at 0550, 10 minutes early. Not simulated, not training-grade pyrotechnics. The first explosion was real. An IED detonated on the vehicle access road, taking out the lead transport and blowing a section of perimeter fence 30 meters from the main structure. The sound was different from training charges. Lena had heard both enough times to know the difference in the chest before the brain finished processing it. She was in the field kitchen when it happened. She was alone. Gerald Pruitt had stayed back at the main campus with a chest cold that had been worsening for 2 days. The second explosion hit the communications relay tower. The radio went to static, then silence. She heard shouting from outside. Then gunfire. Real, live, not the suppressed crack of blanks. Someone was screaming orders. Someone else was screaming something that wasn't orders. Lena stood very still for approximately 3 seconds. She breathed out through her nose. Then she moved. The supply room at the training base was a rectangular prefab structure attached to the main building's northwest corner. She'd inventoried it on Tuesday, partly because that was part of her job, and partly because she'd inventoried every room she'd been in for the past 4 years out of a habit she could no more switch off than she could switch off her heartbeat. She keyed the combination lock on the restricted equipment cage. The combination was in a sealed envelope she'd located in the staff coordinator's binder during routine supply intake. She'd read it once and never looked at it again. Inside the cage, behind the training-grade Miles gear and the blank fire adapters and the first aid kits, there was a hard-sided transit case. Gray. Unmarked except for a long serial number along one edge and a small classification sticker that had been partially obscured. Someone had deliberately covered most of it with a maintenance log sticker, which was either sloppy or intentional, and she didn't have time to determine which. She entered the second combination, different from the first. A 6-digit sequence she'd worked out from the serial number prefix using a methodology she'd spent 8 months developing and hadn't needed to use since, and the case opened. Inside was a disassembled long rifle, precision bolt action, not training equipment, not civilian spec. The barrel alone told her what she needed to know about who this had belonged to and what it had been designed for. She began assembling it. Her hands moved without her having to think about them. The cadets were in bad shape. 12 of them were pinned in the main structure, taking fire from 2 directions. 4 more were behind a burned-out vehicle near the perimeter breach, working with a trauma casualty. One of the defending platoon cadets had taken shrapnel from the first explosion. 3 others were completely out of contact, last seen moving toward the eastern tree line before the comms went down. Cross was inside the main structure, pressed against the wall beside a window, trying to do 3 things at once: manage his cadets, maintain radio contact with a system that was producing nothing but static, and figure out what was happening outside the perimeter with about 10% of the information he needed. He was doing reasonably well at none of them. "Someone has the high ground on the south ridge," said Whitfield, crouched beside him, voice flat. "2 shooters minimum, maybe 3. They've got our exit routes covered." "I know." "The east road is still open. If we move fast..." "The east road goes through 200 meters of open ground before the tree cover starts. They'd see us coming." "Staying here isn't a plan." "I know that too," Cross said. He pressed the transmit button on the radio one more time. Got static, released it. His jaw was tight. He wasn't panicking, which was something, but he was operating in a space his training hadn't fully prepared him for, which was a different problem. Then the first shot came from the north. A single crack, from above, from the roof of the main structure. On the south ridge, something fell. The fire from that position stopped immediately. "What was that?" someone said. Nobody answered, because nobody knew. Second shot. The relay antenna. The attackers had been using for coordination a portable unit they'd erected on the ridge crest, disintegrated. "Someone's shooting back," said Reyes, from near the far wall. "Someone's actually shooting back." "From where?" "The roof." Cross moved to the internal stairwell access. The ladder was bolted to the north wall. He climbed. On the roof, flat against the drainage lip, behind a rifle that had no business being in a training facility, was Lena Voss. She wasn't wearing her chef's jacket. Underneath it, she'd had on a low-profile tactical vest, older model, well-maintained, the kind of gear that had been used and cared for over many years. She had 3 magazines lined up beside her right hand. She was behind the scope, breathing slow, body completely still except for the minute adjustments of her right index finger. Cross climbed onto the roof. She didn't look at him. "Get back inside," she said, not loudly. "You're above the parapet line." "Who are you?" he said, because that was the only question that fit. "Get back inside." Each word the same weight. "I need the roof clear. You're a target up here, and you're in my field of view." He stayed where he was, which was a mistake he would think about later. "That rifle," he said. That's special operations equipment. Where did you..." "Third shooter, northwest quadrant," she said, as though he hadn't spoken. "Setting up on the water tower. I need 60 seconds. She shifted her position 2 inches, adjusted the scope, breathed out. Cross watched her. He'd trained with some of the best instructors Ironvale had. He'd fired thousands of rounds in his career. He knew what someone looked like when they shot well. This was not that. This was something different, something that didn't have a name in any of his coursework. The absolute economy of it. The way her body had become, functionally, an extension of the equipment. No wasted motion, no visible effort, just a stillness so complete it seemed to cancel out the sound of gunfire below them. The rifle fired. Cross flinched. He'd been prepared for the shot, and he still flinched. On the water tower, 310 meters away, the third shooter stopped setting up. The northwest fire ceased. The pattern below them was already beginning to break apart. The attacking force was losing its coordination, losing its communication, losing the elevated positions that had given it control of the engagement. Lena had taken 3 shots in under 4 minutes. Each one had hit a critical node. She reached for the second magazine. "I'm going to ask you one more time," she said. "Go back inside and tell your people to be ready to move on my signal. Eastern exit, through the fence breach, to the ridge road. You'll have a 90-second window. Don't waste it." Cross stood there for one more second. Then he climbed back down. Below, the cadets heard the radio crackle for the first time in 40 minutes. Not the Academy's frequency. A different one. A voice they didn't recognize, calm and precise, calling coordinates in a format that wasn't standard cadet protocol. It was the older military phonetic system, the one used in the field manuals they'd studied in second-year tactics, but that nobody actually spoke anymore. Nobody except people who'd learned it when it was still standard. Alpha element, prepare to move. Eastern breach, staggered column, 30-second intervals. Lead element moves on my mark. You will have a clear window. Do not hesitate at the breach. Move through and keep moving. Mark in 60 seconds. Whitfield was already on his feet. "Who is that?" said Reyes. Whitfield looked at the ceiling, at the roof above them. "The cook," he said, and there was something complicated in his voice that was not quite disbelief and not quite awe, but lived somewhere between the two. The window arrived, they moved, and as they poured through the breach in the eastern fence and sprinted for the ridge road, the last thing Cross saw when he looked back at the main structure was a figure on the roof, still in position, still behind the scope, providing overwatch for the retreat of the people who had stood her on a dining table and laughed. He turned and ran. He ran fast, but he couldn't outrun the thought that had lodged itself somewhere behind his sternum and refused to move. She knew exactly what kind of soldiers we were the moment she walked into that room, and she came up here anyway. The ridge road opened up ahead of them. The gunfire behind them had gone almost completely silent, almost, because from the south ridge, from a position that had been dormant since Lena's second shot, a position that everyone had assumed was neutralized, a new shooter settled in behind his optic, sighted on the retreating column of cadets, and slowly moved his crosshairs toward the lead element. He hadn't been neutralized, he'd been waiting, and Lena, on the roof, hadn't seen him yet. The shooter on the south ridge had been patient in the way that only trained patience looks. Not stillness born of hesitation, but the deliberate mechanical calm of someone who had done this before and understood that rushing was how you wasted the shot. He'd gone quiet after Lena's second round took out the relay antenna. Let the chaos below do its work. Let the defending cadets assume the ridge was clear. He'd pulled back behind the rock outcropping, repositioned 6 meters east, and waited for the column to form up at the breach. He was good. Not good enough. Lena had picked up the movement in her peripheral vision 2 seconds before she registered it consciously. A shift in the shadow line along the south ridge that didn't match the wind direction. Her brain filed it before her eyes fully processed it, the way a body flinches before the sound of a gunshot arrives, pure trained reflex running ahead of deliberate thought. She swung the rifle. The crosshairs found him at the same moment his crosshairs found the lead cadet in the column. She fired. The round hit the rock face 8 inches left of his position. Close enough. He rolled back behind cover, lost his sight line, and by the time he reset, the lead element had already cleared the breach and was into the tree cover on the other side. Not a clean hit. She knew that immediately. I was still alive, still mobile, somewhere behind that outcropping, and she had maybe 40 seconds before he repositioned again. The column was still moving. The trailing elements were still exposed. She adjusted, breathed, waited for him to show her something. He didn't. 30 seconds passed. The last of the cadets cleared the breach. The tree cover swallowed them. The south ridge stayed still. Lena held her position for another full minute, watching, before she finally eased her finger away from the trigger. Her right hand had a faint tremor in it. She noticed that without judgment, the way you notice weather. Not fear. Adrenaline metabolism, blood sugar, the ordinary physiological cost of sustained high-focus work. She was out of practice in ways that mattered and hadn't fully admitted to herself until this moment. She rolled back from the parapet and sat with her back against the low drainage wall out of any possible sight line from the ridge, and let herself have 30 seconds of just breathing. The rifle lay across her thighs. The second magazine was still full. Below her, the training base was quiet in the specific way that spaces go quiet after violence. Not peaceful, but emptied, the air still carrying a charge that hadn't fully discharged yet. Smoke from the IED at the vehicle road had thinned to a gray haze drifting east. The perimeter breach gaped open, fence posts bent outward. One of the prefab structures along the south wall had taken shrapnel damage, a cluster of pockmarks across its exterior wall that would need to be documented and would raise questions nobody at Ironvale was currently prepared to answer. She looked at her hands. The tremor was already fading. She began breaking down the rifle. Colonel Hale arrived at the training base at 0830, 40 minutes after the last active contact report. She came in the second vehicle of a 4-truck convoy, 2 staff vehicles and 2 security elements, which was more than the situation strictly required, and fewer than her instinct had initially suggested. She'd split the difference, which was what she usually did when she didn't yet have enough information to commit fully to either option. The scene at the base told her most of what she needed to know before anyone briefed her. She walked the perimeter breach first, then the vehicle road where the IED had detonated, then the main structure. She took her time. She didn't say much. The two staff officers trailing her had learned over the years that her silence during a sight walk meant she was accumulating a picture and that premature commentary disrupted the process. The casualty from the shrapnel hit, a third-year cadet named Osei, defending platoon, had been stabilized and evacuated ahead of Hale's arrival. Laceration to the left forearm, moderate blood loss, already en route to the Academy's medical facility. Not life-threatening. That was the best news she'd gotten since her radio lit up 2 hours ago. The cadets from the retreating column were gathered in the secondary structure, seated, most of them, with the particular stillness of people who have recently survived something and haven't finished understanding it yet. A few were being checked over by the medic who'd come in with Hale's convoy. Most of them were just sitting. Cross was standing. He had his arms crossed and was looking at the floor with an expression Hale recognized as the specific shame of a person who has been wrong about something important. "Captain Cross," she said. He looked up. "Colonel." "Walk me through it." He did. Credit to him. He was accurate, organized, and didn't attempt to soften his own failures in the account. He described the initial IED, the communication loss, the sniper positions on the South Ridge, the point at which his command decisions had effectively stalled because the tactical situation exceeded his available response options. He described the shots from the roof. He described the voice on the radio. Then he stopped. "Go ahead," Hale said. "When I went up to the roof," he paused, recalibrated. It was the kitchen worker, the civilian food contractor, Lena Voss. Hale's expression didn't change. "She was running overwatch for the column's evacuation," Cross continued. "She used a rifle from the restricted equipment cage. I don't know how she accessed it. The shooting was—" He stopped again, and this time the pause was different, not tactical. "I've never seen anything like it." Hale said, "Where is she now?" Nobody knew. Lena had come down from the roof through the interior stairwell, returned the rifle case to the equipment cage, locked it, both locks, precisely as she'd found it, and was sitting in the field kitchen drinking black coffee when Hale found her. The kitchen was functional, barely. One of the prep tables had been shifted during the initial chaos when everyone ran toward the sounds. A cutting board had fallen and cracked. Otherwise, it was the same as it had been at 0500, when Lena had been portioning breakfast rations for the cadet defensive element. She had her chef's jacket back on. She'd put the tactical vest back in her personal bag, a worn canvas duffel she'd kept in the kitchen storage room since Tuesday. She looked, superficially, exactly as she always looked, neat, quiet, unremarkable. Hale came in alone and closed the door behind her. Lena didn't get up. "Colonel," she said. Hale sat down across from her at the prep table. She folded her hands in front of her and studied Lena for a moment with the unhurried attention of someone who had learned that the first observation was usually incomplete. "You accessed the restricted equipment cage," Hale said. "Yes." "The combination locks on that cage are classified." "I know." "You want to explain how you opened them?" "Not particularly," Lena said. Hale's expression didn't shift. "That wasn't a request." Lena looked at her coffee cup, set it down. "The first combination was in the staff coordinator's intake binder, filed under Emergency Access Protocols, sealed envelope, second page of the section on medical response assets. That's a storage error, not a classified breach." She paused. "The second combination I worked out independently. That one I can't give you a simple answer on." "Try." Serial number prefix on the case matches a manufacturing batch from a specific production window. Units from that batch were issued to 4 operational elements between 6 and 9 years ago. The combination assignment protocols for that issuance used a derivation system that I happen to know. Silence. Hale said, "You happen to know?" "Yes." "Because..." Lena looked at her directly for the first time. Her eyes were a pale, steady gray, and they held Hale's gaze without aggression or apology or any of the things people usually put in their eyes when they were deciding how much to give away. "Because I'm familiar with the issuance protocols for that program." Another silence, longer this time. Hale said, "The rifle in that case belongs to a classification level that has no business being in a training base equipment cage. I'm going to need to understand how it got there." "That's a different question from how I opened the case." "It's related." "It's related," Lena agreed, "but it's not a question I can answer because I genuinely don't know. It was there when I inventoried the cage on Tuesday. I documented it. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a folded sheet, a supply inventory form, handwritten in small, precise print, with a line item near the bottom that read, Restricted Transit Case, Long Arm, Gray, Unmarked, Combination Locked. Origin unknown. Flagged for verification. She'd signed and dated it Tuesday evening. I submitted this to the staff coordinator's office. I don't know if anyone read it. Hale took the form, read it, set it down. You documented it and then used it. I documented it and then a live attack happened. Those are different situations. You could have left it in the cage. Yes. Why didn't you? Lena was quiet for a moment. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because the honest answer was several layers underneath the simple one, and she was deciding how far down to go. Because I counted the sight lines from the roof at 06:15 this morning, she said finally, before any of this started. Habit. And I knew that if someone hit the ridge positions and somebody with the right equipment was up there, the column could get out clean. Without that, she stopped. Without that, you'd be having a different conversation right now. Hale looked at her for a long time. Who are you? She said. Not the way Cross had said it on the roof, not with shock or confusion, with something more specific. The question of a person who has been fitting pieces together for 3 weeks and has just found the corner piece. Lena Voss, she said, kitchen staff, civilian contractor. That's your name. I asked who you are. I know what you asked. And? Lena picked up her coffee cup. It was empty. She turned it in her hands once and set it back down. I'm not ready to answer that question, Colonel. I'm sorry. Hale sat back. She had the look of a person who has just determined exactly how much pushing is appropriate and has decided the answer is not yet. You're going to need to answer it, she said. Not today, but soon. I know, Lena said. But the debrief that afternoon lasted 4 hours and took place in the main structure's conference room, which still smelled faintly of smoke. Hale ran it. A JAG officer named Tron had been pulled from the main campus and sat at the far end of the table with a legal pad and an expression of concentrated attention. 2 senior instructors from the Tactics Division were present. Cross and Whitfield attended as primary witness accounts for the cadet element. Lena was not present. She'd been told to remain available on base and had gone back to the field kitchen and prepared lunch for the staff and security personnel with the same methodical quiet she brought to every meal service. She could hear, distantly, the sound of rotors. 2 helicopters had arrived around noon. Not Academy transport. Different agency markings that she'd clocked from the kitchen window and filed without expression. Somebody above Hale's level was already aware the situation existed. That had been inevitable. She'd understood that when she picked up the rifle. She'd accepted it the same way she'd accepted everything else that had been inevitable in her life. Without flinching, without planning to, and with a certainty that the cost was going to be exactly as high as it looked. Pruitt called from the main campus around 2. I heard something happened out there, he said. His voice had the careful neutrality of someone who has heard quite a bit more than something. You okay? Fine, Lena said. Finish healing your chest cold. I've got the kitchen covered. The assistant director of operations called me 20 minutes ago asking about you. What did you tell him? That you're my best knife hand and you never miss a service time. A pause. Lena, what happened out there? She was quiet for a moment, watching steam rise from the pot on the front burner. There was a situation and I helped with it. That's all I can tell you right now. He was quiet on his end for longer than was comfortable. Then, should I be worried about you? No, she said. Get some rest, Gerald. She hung up. Cross found her at 4:30, between the debrief and the evening briefing that Hale had scheduled for all personnel on base. He came into the kitchen without knocking. The door was open, and stood just inside the threshold for a moment, the way people stand when they've decided to say something and are still deciding how to start. Lena was washing prep bowls. She didn't turn around. Captain, she said, how did you know I was there? The way you walk. You put more weight on your right foot than your left. Old injury, probably. You've compensated well, but it's still there. He was quiet. She rinsed a bowl and set it in the drying rack. What do you need? He came a few steps further into the kitchen. She still hadn't turned around, which seemed to be bothering him in a way he hadn't anticipated. I wanted to say something, he said. Okay. The thing this morning, on the table, that was, I shouldn't have done that. She turned the water off, dried her hands on a clean cloth, turned around. Cross was not, in this moment, the same person who had grinned at a room full of cadets and gestured at an elevated chair like he was conducting entertainment. He looked younger without the performance of himself, which was unsettling in its own way. It made him harder to dismiss. No, she said. You shouldn't have. I want to explain. You don't need to explain it to me. I understood it the moment it happened. She put the cloth down. You've been the top-ranked cadet here for 2 years. Your family name opens doors before you walk through them. You've been told you're exceptional for so long that it stopped feeling like a compliment and started feeling like a fact. So when someone you've decided is below you says something you can't immediately refute, the easiest response is to make the room laugh. She paused. I understand it. That doesn't mean I'm going to tell you it was okay. Cross's jaw tightened. That's a very thorough assessment. 7 weeks, she said. I've been watching for 7 weeks. What else did you see? She looked at him for a moment. Whitfield, you're second. He's better than you at the tactical thinking, and you know it. You use him when you need the answer, and then you make sure the room sees you as the one who made the call. That's a bad habit for a future commander. The tightening in his jaw moved up to his eyes. She watched him work through the options: denial, deflection, anger. He tried them all briefly, discarded them, and landed somewhere that looked like the uncomfortable terrain of someone encountering an accurate observation they weren't ready for. You got all that from the kitchen. People talk in front of service staff the way they talk in front of furniture, she said. You stop hearing it after a while. I never stopped hearing it. He looked at the floor, then back at her. On the roof, the way you were shooting. Captain. I've never seen anything. Captain Cross. Her voice was still quiet, but it had an edge to it now, the kind that came from something other than volume. I understand you have questions. I can't answer them. What happened on that roof? What you think you saw? That's not a conversation I'm in a position to have with you. Colonel Hale is going to make you have it with someone. I know. She's already making calls, he said. I heard one of the JAG staff saying there's a federal review team on the way. That's not academy level. That's something higher. Lena looked at the pot on the back burner, which was starting to show the first small bubbles that preceded a boil, and reached over to turn the heat down without looking like she was using the motion to avoid his gaze, which is exactly what she was doing. It'll be fine, she said. You're not nervous. No. Why not? She didn't answer that. She picked up the cloth again and folded it in thirds and set it on the counter beside the sink, straight, the way she said everything, precisely, without excess. There's food at 1800, she said. I'd recommend eating something before the briefing. It's going to be a long night. He stood there a moment longer, as though hoping the conversation would reopen. Then he nodded, once, and left. The long night started early. At 5:15, Hale came into the kitchen personally, which was unusual enough that Lena set down what she was doing and gave her full attention before the colonel said a word. Federal review team lands at 1900, Hale said. I need you available for questioning, not optional. Understood. They're from a unit I'm not at liberty to name in this context. She paused in a way that was very precisely calibrated. They asked about you specifically, by name. Lena absorbed that, kept her face neutral, which took more effort this time than she would have liked. They knew my name, she said. Not a question. They knew considerably more than your name, Hale said. Whatever's in your file, I've requested access and I've been denied at my clearance level. I want you to understand what that means before tonight. It meant somebody at a very high level had classified whatever existed about Lena Voss, which meant somebody at a very high level knew she was here, which meant her 7 weeks of deliberate invisibility had been, at least partially, an illusion she'd been allowed to maintain. I understand, she said. Haley studied her. You don't look surprised. I'm not. You want to tell me why? Lena looked at the colonel for a moment, this lean, precise, watchful woman who had been quietly observing her for weeks and had earned, in Lena's assessment, a level of straightforwardness that most people in this situation would not have received. No, she said, but I appreciate the warning. Hale accepted that. She turned to leave, then stopped, turned back. The shot on the south ridge, she said, The last one, before the column cleared. You hit the rock face, not the shooter. Yes. Intentional? Lena was quiet for 2 seconds. Yes. Hale looked at her for a moment longer. Something moved in her expression. Not surprise, but recognition. The quiet kind that comes when a person confirms something they suspected. You could have made that shot. He was a trained asset running a live-fire interdiction in an unsecured zone against an unarmed civilian training element. He was also the only person on that ridge who might know who sent him and how this got organized. She met Hale's eyes steadily. I thought someone might want to ask him questions later. The kitchen was quiet. There's no one in custody, Hale said. He was gone by the time we swept the ridge. Lena's expression didn't change, but something around her eyes shifted, fractionally, in a way that might have been frustration or might have been something older and less nameable. Then I made a mistake, she said. It was the flattest thing she'd said all day, and somehow it was the sentence that landed heaviest. Hale left. Lena stood at the prep table with her hands flat on the surface and looked at nothing in particular, and for the first time since 0550 that morning, she let herself think about what it meant that someone had organized a live-fire attack on a military training base and that the attack had been real, and that the shooter on the South Ridge had been waiting in a repositioned hide with deliberate patience, and that someone somewhere had decided this specific place, this specific day, was the right time and location for that operation. She thought about the mounting bracket on the communications antenna that the staff sergeant hadn't fixed. She thought about the secondary generator she'd refueled herself, which had kept power to the base long enough for the evacuation radio communication to work. She thought about the field maps with the incorrect standoff distances and the eastern tree line, 300 meters closer than documented, which she hadn't mentioned to anyone and which had almost mattered badly. They're not ready, she'd written in her notebook. She hadn't been writing about the cadets. She turned back to the stove. At 7 o'clock, she would serve dinner. At 8 o'clock, she would walk into a room with a federal review team that knew her name and had a file on her that was classified above a colonel's access level. And she would answer their questions or not answer their questions, depending on what the questions were, and who was in the room and what they were actually trying to find out versus what they said they were trying to find out. And somewhere on the mountain, the shooter from the South Ridge was mobile and unaccounted for. She turned the heat up on the back burner and reached for the salt. The federal review team was not what Lena had expected, which meant they were exactly what she should have expected. She'd anticipated 2, maybe 3 people. Suits. Legal pads. The standard posture of institutional authority arriving to determine what had happened and who was responsible and how to contain it. She'd sat across from that configuration before. She knew how it moved. What came off the helicopters at 1900 was a 4-person team led by a woman in her mid-40s named Supervisory Agent Dara Kessler, who wore civilian clothes that fit too precisely and moved through the base with the low, economical attention of someone who was continuously mapping her environment. Behind her came 2 men whose function was not immediately clear from their appearance, but became clear from the way they deployed to the room's corners before anyone sat down. The 4th person was a young analyst who carried a hard-case laptop and said nothing for the entire first hour. They set up in the main structure's conference room. Hale was present. The JAG officer Tran was present. Cross and Whitfield had been told to remain available but were not in the room. Lena sat at the center of one long side of the table. Kessler sat directly across from her and opened a folder she'd brought from the helicopter and set on the table without immediately looking at it. Ms. Voss, she said. Agent Kessler. A pause. Kessler noted something about that. Not in writing, just in the fractional adjustment of her attention. You know who I am. I read the badge when you came through the door. Kessler glanced at Hale, looked back at Lena. I'm going to be direct with you, because I think that will save us both time. We know who you are. We know your operational history. We have your file, the real one, not the contractor credentials. And it's been reviewed by personnel with appropriate clearance. She paused. What we don't know is what you were doing here. Not officially. Not as a civilian kitchen contractor. I was cooking, Lena said. For 7 weeks. The job is 7 weeks into a semester-long assignment. Ms. Voss. I'm serious, Lena said. I took a job. I've been doing the job. What happened this morning was not part of the job, but I made a judgment call, and I stand by it. Kessler looked at her for a moment. She had the kind of patience that wasn't passive. It was active, deliberate, like a held breath. The rifle in the equipment cage. How long have you known it was there? Since Tuesday. And you documented it? Yes. Why didn't you report it through a higher channel? I submitted inventory documentation to the staff coordinator. That is the appropriate channel for a civilian food contractor who finds unaccounted equipment in a supply room. She held Kessler's gaze. I'm not in a position to use other channels. That was a deliberate choice I made before I came here, and I've maintained it. Kessler opened the folder. She turned it so Lena could see the top page. Not to share information, Lena understood, but to confirm she recognized it. It was a personnel file. The header was a classification marking she hadn't seen on a printed document in 4 years, which meant the file predated her disappearance from the system and had been maintained after it. She looked at it without expression. The call sign on record, Kessler said, is Ghost Widow. 17 confirmed operations, 9 of which remain classified at a level above this room. 3 commendations. 2 purple citations that were never formally recorded because the operations themselves don't formally exist. She paused. And then 4 years ago, after an operation designated hollow terrain, you resigned your commission, declined a medical evaluation, and disappeared. The room was very quiet. Tran had stopped writing. Hale was looking at the table. I didn't disappear, Lena said. I changed employment. To kitchen work. It's honest work. Kessler closed the folder. She leaned forward slightly, both hands flat on the table. Ms. Voss, I want to understand what happened on that roof this morning, and I want to understand why a person with your operational background is cooking eggs at a military academy, and I want to understand whether those 2 things are connected. I'm asking you to help me understand that. Lena looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, what happened on the roof this morning was a tactical response to an active threat against unarmed personnel. The threat was real, not training grade, and the response was proportionate. If you're asking whether I regret it, I don't. She folded her hands on the table. Why I'm here? That's a longer answer, and I'm not sure this is the room for it. Then what room is it for? She didn't answer. Kessler sat back. She looked at Hale. Colonel, can we have the room? Hale stood without comment and left, taking Tron with her. The 2 men at the corners of the room didn't move. The analyst kept his eyes on his screen. When the door closed, Kessler said, in a different register, quieter, less formal, the voice of a person rather than a process. I worked the hollow terrain debrief. Not directly. Adjacent. I saw what the after-action documentation said. She paused. I also saw what it didn't say. Lena looked at the table surface. What it didn't say, Kessler continued carefully, was why you left. The file says medical evaluation declined, commission resigned, contact discontinued. It doesn't say why a 17-operation asset with your record walked away without a word. No, Lena said, it wouldn't. I'm asking. I know you are. Silence. 3 people, Lena said finally. My team. Hollow terrain. We went in on a 4-person element and I came out alone and the operation was classified successful, which is a designation that means the objective was achieved and does not speak to anything else at all. She stopped. I've said everything I'm going to say about that. Kessler was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry, she said, and she meant it. Lena could tell the difference between a procedural expression of condolence and an actual one, and this was the latter. Thank you, Lena said. It came out flatter than she intended. Kessler looked at the folder again, then at Lena. The attack this morning, do you have any assessment of who organized it? And there it was. The question underneath all the other questions. Lena said, the IED placement was professional, not academy-trained professional, operationally experienced. The ridge positions were set up with awareness of the base's communication antenna layout, which means either advanced reconnaissance or access to the base schematics. The shooter on the south ridge used a patience discipline that takes years to build. She paused. This wasn't a random insurgent action against a soft target. Whoever planned this knew what they were hitting and had a reason to hit it specifically. We think so too, Kessler said. Which means the question isn't just who. It's why this base, why today, why now? Kessler looked at her steadily. We have a working theory. So do I, Lena said. Another silence, different from the previous ones. You think you were the target, Kessler said. I think it's possible. Why? Because whoever put that rifle in the equipment cage knew I was here, Lena said, and they knew what I'd do with it. She didn't sleep that night. Not because she couldn't, she'd learned to sleep in worse circumstances than a field kitchen cot, but because she'd given herself the hours between midnight and 4 to think without interruption, and she used them. The rifle in the cage. She kept coming back to that. It had been placed there, she was increasingly certain, not to be found by a staff coordinator or a routine inspection, but to be found by someone who knew what they were looking at. The obscured classification sticker. The second combination lock with its derivable sequence. It was a breadcrumb trail designed for a specific kind of person. She thought about the incorrectly installed antenna bracket, the documentation errors on the field maps, the fuel level on the secondary generator that nobody had caught until she caught it. Small failures, each one individually explainable. Together they formed a pattern that looked less like negligence and more like preparation. Someone had been inside this base before the attack, had made small modifications, had ensured specific vulnerabilities were in place, and had left a weapon where one specific person was most likely to find it. She didn't know yet whether that was a trap or an asset drop. She wasn't sure those were mutually exclusive. At 4:45, her internal clock did what it always did, and she got up. The morning was cold, the kind of mountain cold that came before dawn with a sharp mineral clarity. Lena walked the perimeter fence, outside the wire, technically, which she'd noted was an access control failure nobody had corrected, and worked the problem the way she always worked problems, by moving through the physical space until the geography told her something the reports hadn't. The south ridge was visible from the eastern fence line. In daylight, the rock outcropping where the patient shooter had repositioned stood out clearly. A gray prominence against darker stone, natural cover, good angle to the perimeter breach. She'd hit the face of it from 310 meters in low light and wind. She'd chosen to. She looked at it for a while. Then she walked the eastern fence line to the breach point and stood where the column had come through. The ground was churned where boots had passed. There were 3 spots of dried blood on the fence post where someone had caught themselves in the haste. She crouched and looked at the tree cover beyond the fence line. There were boot prints in the soft ground at the tree line's edge. Not from the cadets. The cadets had come through the breach and continued toward the ridge road. These prints ran parallel to the fence and stopped at a point where the underbrush thickened. Someone had been watching the breach from the tree line. Not shooting. Watching. She looked at the prints more carefully. One set, single person, standard military boot, size 10 or 11, moderately loaded given the depth of impression. They'd stood there for a while. There was compression pattern around the edges that suggested sustained weight rather than a passing step. She stood up. The review team was still at the base. Kessler would want to know about the prints before weather or foot traffic degraded them. She was still looking at the tree line when she heard the movement behind her. It was minimal, the kind of sound that existed at the lower threshold of perceptible noise. A boot on gravel, a single step displaced. Most people wouldn't have registered it as deliberate. She didn't move. "I know you're there," she said, at normal conversational volume. A pause. Then, "You're better than I expected." Male voice, moderate register, no detectable regional accent, which was itself a kind of accent, the controlled neutrality of someone who'd trained the markers out. He came out of the tree line at her 2 o'clock, moving carefully, hands visible. He was wearing civilian hiking gear that was too well fitted to be recreational. Medium height, early 40s, with a face that was structured to be forgettable. He was not carrying a visible weapon, which told her nothing useful since the most dangerous positions to carry were the ones she couldn't see. She turned to face him. "You were on the ridge," she said. "Not the south ridge." She was looking at his right hand, the small abrasion on the heel, the kind you got from a quick rope descent on rough stone. The south ridge shooter had used a rock hide. This man's abrasion was higher on the palm, consistent with a vertical descent. "The northwest position," she said. "Water tower." He stopped about 4 meters from her. "You made that shot at dawn in a crosswind." The crosswind was actually helpful. He almost smiled. It didn't make him look friendly. "We needed to know if you were still operable." "I'm a kitchen contractor." "Voss." "I'm retired." "Nobody in your former line of work retires at 38. She looked at him steadily. "Who sent you?" Someone who has a problem you're uniquely suited to solve. Yesterday was the test. Yesterday was the assessment, he said. The distinction matters. A test you can fail. An assessment just tells us what we're working with. She turned that over. You organized a live attack on a training base with active cadets in it to assess whether I could still shoot. We made sure the risk to the cadets was manageable. OC took shrapnel. Something moved in his face. That was an unplanned variable. We regret it. He's 19. I know. It wasn't the intent. He paused. It also demonstrates why the situation that generated this operation is serious enough to do what we did. Lena looked at him for a long moment. The cold was working its way through her jacket. The tree line behind him was still and dark. She was assessing distances, angles, options, the way her brain did automatically, and she'd stopped fighting years ago. What situation? She said. He reached into his jacket, slowly, deliberately telegraphing the motion, and produced a folded document. He held it out. She didn't move toward it immediately. He set it on top of the nearest fence post and stepped back. She crossed to the post and unfolded it. It was a satellite image, time-stamped 48 hours ago. She recognized the terrain type, high mountain, eastern range, specific geological signature. She recognized the cluster of structures in the lower right quadrant, partially obscured by tree cover. She looked at it for 5 seconds. Then she folded it and put it in her jacket pocket. That's an active installation, she said. Yes. The people shown in this image in a non-military capacity near the northeastern access point. Yes. How many? 11 confirmed. We think more. She breathed out through her nose. How long? 6 weeks. You've known for 6 weeks. We've been building a picture for 6 weeks, he said. We've been building a picture for 6 weeks, he said. You needed a specific operational capability before you could move on it, she said, which is why you ran an assessment on the only person whose file matches what you need. She looked at him directly. That installation is in high-altitude terrain. Access routes are limited and covered. Anyone going in from the standard approaches gets seen. You need someone who can hold a position in that environment for an extended period, manage multiple sight lines simultaneously, and provide overwatch while a ground element works. She paused. You need a precision long-range asset who can function independently for 3 to 5 days in sub-zero mountain conditions. Yes, he said. There are currently active duty personnel who fit that profile. The installation has intelligence assets embedded with the people inside it, he said. Active duty personnel require a formal mission authorization chain that has been compromised at a level we can't currently identify. We need someone off the official chain entirely. Someone who doesn't officially exist anymore. Someone whose file, as of 4 years ago, is classified inactive and inaccessible without clearance that very few people have. He looked at her steadily. Someone who's been cooking breakfast at a military academy for 7 weeks and hasn't spoken to anyone from her former life. She put her hand in her jacket pocket and touched the folded satellite image. No, she said. He didn't react. I'm not in that life anymore, she said. I made a decision 4 years ago and I've held to it. What happened yesterday? That was a one-time response to an immediate threat in front of me. It doesn't change anything. There are 11 people in that installation who, don't, she said, with a flatness that stopped him mid-sentence. Don't tell me who they are. Don't tell me what happens to them if I decline. That's a tactic, and I'm not going to respond to it. He was quiet. I want you to leave, she said, and I want you to understand that I'm going to report this conversation to Agent Kessler within the hour. That's your right, he said. Who are you? Does it matter? Yes. He considered that. My name isn't something I'm going to give you, but I can tell you that the organization I represent is aware that what we did yesterday was wrong, and I can tell you that the situation in that image is real and deteriorating, and I can tell you... He stopped, recalibrated. When he spoke again, the formal register had shifted to something rawer and less managed. I can tell you that 2 of the 11 people in that installation were part of a previous operation you ran support for. That's not a manipulation tactic. It's a fact I thought you deserved to know. The fence post was solid behind her. She was very still. Which operation? She said. He told her. She looked at him for a long time. Leave, she said finally. Her voice had not changed. Everything else about her had. He nodded once, and walked back into the tree line. She reported the conversation to Kessler at 0615. She included the boot prints, the satellite image, the content of the exchange, and the name of the previous operation he'd cited. Kessler listened without interrupting. When Lena finished, Kessler was quiet for long enough that the silence had its own texture. "You know what operation that was?" Kessler said. "Yes." "And you know what it means that he cited it?" "Yes." "Ms. Voss." "I said no," Lena said. "I reported the contact because it was the right thing to do. My answer is still no." Kessler looked at her. "Okay. I want to go back to the main campus. I want to finish my contract. I want to be left alone." "I'll do what I can," Kessler said, which was not an agreement but was, coming from her, as close to honesty as the situation allowed. But by noon, the Federal Review team had packed its cases and loaded back onto the helicopters. The base was returning to something resembling normal, with the particular forced normalcy of people who have been told to resume routine operations following an incident that nobody is officially discussing yet. Hale arranged transport back to the main campus for the cadets and remaining staff. Lena rode in the last vehicle, in the back, with her canvas duffel between her feet. Cross was in the same vehicle. He sat up front and didn't turn around for most of the drive. When they were about 3 kilometers from the main campus, with the academy's stone buildings visible on the ridge ahead, he turned. "The federal team," he said. "They questioned you for a long time." "Yes." "Everything okay?" She looked out the window. The mountain terrain was moving past, gray-green in the midday light, the ridges solid and old under a sky that had been threatening rain since morning and still hadn't delivered. "Fine." He turned back to face front. Then, after a moment, "What you said yesterday, about Whitfield." She didn't respond. "You were right," he said to the windshield. "I know you were right. I've known for about a year and I haven't done anything about it." She looked at his profile. He wasn't asking for absolution. He was just saying a true thing that needed to be said out loud. "That's worth something," she said, knowing it. "Is it enough?" "No," she said. "But it's where you start." He nodded, once, and turned back to the road. She was back in the kitchen by 1400. Gerald Pruitt was there, chest cold marginally improved, moving slower than usual and wearing the look of a man who had questions he had decided, wisely, not to ask. He made her a cup of coffee without being asked and set it on her station without comment. She drank it while she inventoried the afternoon's prep requirements. The kitchen smelled of disinfectant and the faint residue of that morning's breakfast service. And it was familiar in the way that functional, honest places are familiar. No performance in it, nothing pretending to be something it wasn't. She was halfway through the vegetable prep when her hands slowed. She was thinking about the satellite image, the cluster of structures in the lower right quadrant, the northeastern access point. She was thinking about the operation he'd named, about the faces that went with that operation. 2 of them, he'd said. She set down the knife, picked it up again. She didn't have enough information to do anything with what he'd told her, and she wasn't going to act on incomplete information from an unverified source running an unauthorized approach. That was what she told herself. She kept working. At 15:30, the door of the kitchen opened and Hale came in. She wasn't moving with her usual economy this time. She was moving faster, and her face had the specific compression of a person managing urgent information. "Voss," she said. Lena set down the knife. "We've had a development," Hale said. "The shooter from the South Ridge, the one you let walk." "What about him?" "He made contact, not with us, with Academy Communications, civilian channel, unencrypted, which means he wanted us to hear it." Hale stopped in front of her. "He knows you're on campus. He identified you by call sign. He says if you're not gone from Ironvale by 0600 tomorrow, he's going to finish what he started on the ridge." She paused. "With a different target." Lena went very still. "He named Cross," Hale said. "Specifically, by name." The kitchen was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigeration units and the distant sound of cadets on the drill ground outside, their cadence calls carrying faintly through the walls. Lena looked at her hands. The knife was on the cutting board. The vegetables were half done. "He's not trying to run me off," she said. "No. He's trying to activate me." Hale said nothing, which was its own answer. Lena picked up the knife and set it in the utensil rack, blade down. She untied her apron. She reached under the prep table for her canvas duffel, which she'd brought in from the vehicle and not put in the storage room, because she hadn't been certain, from the moment she stepped off that truck, that she was going to need it to stay where she could reach it in a hurry. She set it on the prep table and unzipped it. The tactical vest was on top. "I need to make a phone call," she said, "and I'm going to need access to your secure communication line." Hale looked at the vest, then at Lena. "I thought you said no." "I said no to an unsanctioned operation run by an unverified asset through an unauthorized contact." She pulled the vest out and set it on the table, checking the fit of the plates automatically, hands moving with the ease of old muscle memory. "This is different. This is somebody using a 19-year-old cadet's name as leverage on me in a facility I'm responsible for." "You're responsible for the kitchen." "I'm responsible for the kitchen," Lena agreed. "And right now the kitchen is the safest place in this building, and I need it to stay that way, which means the person outside the wire who just announced his position and his intention needs to understand what he's actually dealing with." She pulled the vest on, adjusted the straps. Hale watched her. "If I authorize this," the colonel said carefully, "I need to know who I'm authorizing." Lena looked at her. "You've seen my file." "I've seen the classification level of your file. I haven't seen what's in it." "Then I'll tell you what's relevant." She picked up the duffel and zipped it closed. "My name is Lena Voss, former designation Ghost Widow. 17 confirmed operations, 3 of which involved direct long-range interdiction in high-altitude mountain terrain under sustained adverse conditions." She met Hale's eyes. "And the last person who used a 19-year-old as leverage on me is not someone you can ask about it." The kitchen hummed. Hale said, "What do you need?" Lena told her. What she needed took Hale 40 minutes to arrange, which was faster than Lena had expected, and said something about the colonel's actual reach within the institution. A secure communication line in the Tactical Operations Center, access to the base's external sensor array, 4 cameras covering the perimeter approaches, 2 of which were functional and 2 of which had been offline since Tuesday, a fact that now carried a different weight than it had when she'd first noticed it. A sidearm, which Hale produced from her own office and set on the table without comment, and a direct channel to Kessler, who was still airborne but turned her helicopter around when Hale's call came through and was 40 minutes out. Cross she handled herself. She went to his quarters, knocked once, and when he opened the door she said without preamble, "Someone made a threat against you specifically. I need you to move to the interior barracks for tonight. Don't tell anyone where you're going except Whitfield, and don't use your personal phone." He stared at her. He was in civilian clothes, an academy sweatshirt and track pants, which made him look about 6 years younger than he did in uniform. "A threat against me?" "Yes." "From who?" "The shooter from the South Ridge." He processed that. She watched him do it, watched the sequence move through his face, the initial resistance, the calculation, the arrival at the pragmatic conclusion that arguing with her about this was not the optimal use of either of their time. "Because of what happened at the training base," he said. "Because of me," she said. "You're being used as leverage. I want you somewhere that's harder to access while I deal with it." He looked at her for a moment. "You're going after him." "I'm going to make sure he understands that the leverage doesn't work." "That's not what I asked." She held his gaze. "Move to the interior barracks, Captain. Keep your head down, keep your phone off, and trust that I know what I'm doing." He moved. He didn't like it, but he moved. Kessler landed at 2100 with a different configuration than her afternoon departure. The 2 corner men were back, and she'd added a third person, a compact woman named Specialist Arden, who said almost nothing and carried a signals kit that told Lena she was primarily an electronic intelligence function. They gathered in the Tactical Operations Center. Hale had cleared the regular staff out, leaving only her senior watch officer, a steady-eyed sergeant named Burrows, who managed the communications board with the practiced calm of someone who had decided the best response to extraordinary events was to treat them as ordinary ones. Kessler looked at the satellite image Lena had surrendered earlier, now spread on the central table alongside a topographic printout of the surrounding mountain terrain. "The threat on the Academy channel," she said. "We've analyzed the transmission. The voice signature doesn't match any confirmed asset in our database, but the encryption pattern on the carrier signal does. It's old, a communication protocol that was retired approximately 5 years ago." She looked at Lena. "You know whose protocol it was." "Yes," Lena said. "Whose?" Hale asked. Lena said, a special operations support network that was officially dissolved following an internal review 4.5 years ago. The dissolution was listed as administrative restructuring. The actual reason was an integrity failure, so specific personnel using network assets for operations that weren't sanctioned by the chain of command. She paused. I was involved in the review, peripherally. How peripherally? Kessler asked. I provided a written deposition. I wasn't a primary witness. Another pause. The operation they cited to me this morning, Hollow Terrain, was one of the operations that came up in that review. The room was quiet for a moment. Hale said slowly, You're saying the people who attacked this base are connected to a disbanded covert network. I'm saying the communication protocol suggests that. I'm not saying I know it. And the satellite image, Kessler said. The installation. I think the installation is an active remnant of that network, Lena said, operating outside sanction, using assets and infrastructure that were supposed to have been shut down. She looked at the topographic map. And I think the reason they ran an assessment on me at the training base yesterday, and the reason they're using Cross as leverage tonight is because they want to find out if I'm a threat to them, and because they think that if they push hard enough, they can use me instead. Use you for what? Arden asked. It was the first thing she'd said. To get inside the installation. I know the network's protocols. I know the communication architecture. I know how their positioning works in mountain terrain because I ran operations alongside some of these people before I knew what they were actually running. She stopped. I'm the only person outside their structure who has all of that, and they know it. So they want to recruit you, Kessler said, or determine whether I'm a liability they need to manage. The threat against Cross is a test, Lena said. If I run, leave the academy, disappear again, they know I'm not going to be a threat, and they continue operating. If I engage, she stopped. If you engage, Kessler finished, they find out what you're capable of now, 4 years out of operational status. Yes, Kessler looked at the map, at the satellite image, back at Lena. And what are you capable of now? She asked. Not unkind, genuinely. Lena was quiet for a moment. The honest answer to that question had several components, not all of them comfortable to examine. Enough, she said. What? The plan was not elegant. Elegant plans were for situations where you had complete information, adequate personnel, and sufficient time. This situation had none of those things, which meant the plan was built from available materials and acceptable risk margins, and the understanding that something was probably going to go wrong, and the job was to make sure that when it did, the thing that went wrong was recoverable. The shooter, they were calling him Ridge for operational shorthand, had communicated from a position approximately 2 kilometers northwest of the main campus, on a section of mountain approach that the Academy's external sensors didn't cover, which was either luck or advanced knowledge of the camera layout. Arden's signals analysis put his transmission equipment in a fixed location, which meant he was either stationary or had left the equipment running while he moved, and those were 2 very different scenarios. Lena assessed it as the former. He'd made the threat on an open channel, given a specific deadline, and cited a specific target by name. That was a person who wanted to be found, who had decided that being found, on his terms, was the next move. He wants me to come to him, she said. That's a reason not to, Kessler said. It's a reason to think carefully about how. She looked at the sensor coverage map. He's on the northwest approach. The covered approach from the Academy side goes up the maintenance road to the water reclamation facility, then northeast along the ridge spine. That route takes me directly into his observation area. He'll see me coming for the last 400 meters. So you don't use that route, Hale said. I don't use that route directly, Lena said. She put her finger on the topographic map, on a contour line that indicated a ravine running parallel to the ridge spine approximately 150 meters below the crest. The ravine approach is longer by about 40 minutes and requires a technical climb at the north end. No trail. He won't be watching it because it's not a viable approach for most people. Is it a viable approach for you? Hale asked. In the dark, in cold weather, carrying operational load. She considered. Yes, but I need to leave in the next 90 minutes to make the timing work before he expects any response. You're going alone, Kessler said. It wasn't a question. I need to go alone. If I bring support, he'll see it, and this stops being a conversation and becomes an engagement. I don't want an engagement. I want information. She paused. Who sent him? Who organized the training base attack? And what the installation in that image is actually running? And if he decides the conversation is an engagement, Kessler said, then I deal with it. The room absorbed that. Burroughs, at the communications board, had been listening to all of this with the expression of a man who had resolved to feel nothing unusual about his evening. He said, without turning around, I can maintain radio contact on the secure channel through the first kilometer of the ravine approach. After that, you'll lose me until you crest the ridge. I know, Lena said. That's fine. Hale said, I want to note, formally, that I am deeply uncomfortable with this. Noted, Lena said, and that my discomfort has not changed my assessment that you're the right person to do it. Lena looked at her. Something in her chest shifted slightly in a way she didn't entirely have language for. Thank you, Colonel. Don't thank me, Hale said. Come back. She left at 22:40. The night was cold and very dark, the cloud cover that had threatened rain all day having finally delivered on the promise with a thin, persistent drizzle that turned the mountain terrain slick and killed the sound effectively. She moved in civilian outer layers over the tactical vest, dark colors, no reflective surfaces. The sidearm Hale had given her was holstered at her right hip. In the duffel she carried, a compact night optic monocular, a trauma kit, a handheld radio on Burroughs' secure frequency, and a folded copy of the satellite image and topographic map that she'd already memorized but kept as a backup against the specific kind of memory failure that happened when adrenaline metabolism started competing with cognition. The ravine approach was everything she'd told them it would be. Longer, technical, demanding, dark. The drizzle made the rock faces slick and required her to slow her pace significantly on the north end climb, which she'd estimated at 10 minutes and which took 18. Her right hand had the tremor again by the time she topped out onto the ridge spine, less from cold than from exertion, and she gave herself 60 seconds of stillness at the crest to let her heart rate settle before she moved. The ridge spine ran northeast for approximately 600 meters before opening onto the flat prominence where Arden had triangulated Ridge's transmission equipment. The terrain between her and that point was rocky, broken, with natural cover at reasonable intervals. She moved in short bounds, using the cover, pausing to scan before each movement. She found him at the 400-meter mark, not at the transmission equipment, 50 meters short of it, in a natural hollow between two large stones, where he had a clear view of the equipment site and the approach from the academy side. He was sitting with his back to one of the stones and his knees up and a thermos in his hands, which was such a specifically human detail that it took her an extra half-second to process. He hadn't heard her coming. That was the ravine approach. She came around the left-hand stone and sat down on a flat rock approximately 3 meters from him with the sidearm in her right hand resting on her knee. He went rigid. Then he looked at her, in the dark, through the drizzle, and something in his face settled from shock into something that might have been, improbably, satisfaction. Ravine approach, he said. Ravine approach, she agreed. He looked at the sidearm. If you were going to shoot me, you'd have done it from distance. I told you I wanted information. You didn't tell me that. You told Kessler that. You've been monitoring the Tactical Operations Center. We have ears in the building. He said it without particular pride. We've had them for a while. She absorbed that. Then you know I came alone. I know you came without visible support. It's not the same thing. Fair point. She kept the sidearm where it was. Who sent you? I think you already know. I want to hear it from you. He turned the thermos in his hands. He wasn't performing calm. He was actually calm, which was more concerning. The network, he said. What's left of it? After the dissolution and the review and all the administrative restructuring. He said the last 2 words with the flatness of someone quoting a document they hold in contempt. About 30% of the active personnel didn't stand down. They restructured independently, outside the official channels, using infrastructure that wasn't fully documented in the review. Because someone in the review process helped them. Yes. Who? He looked at her. That's a more expensive question. I'm not negotiating with you, she said. You used a 19-year-old cadet's name as a pressure tactic. You organized a live-fire operation against unarmed training personnel. You have ears in a military facilities tactical operations center. Tell me who is running the remnant network, and tell me what the installation in the satellite image is doing. Or what? She looked at him steadily. He took a long breath. The installation is a staging facility. High altitude, remote, defensible. They've been running asset exfiltration through it, personnel and material from active programs that were supposed to be shut down in the dissolution, using them for independent operations. What kind of operations? Contract interdiction, the kind that used to require a classified mission authorization and now just requires a client and a price. She was quiet for a moment. They went private. They went practical, he said. At least that's how they see it. And the two people from the previous operation, the ones you mentioned this morning. He looked away. First time since she'd sat down that his gaze had moved. They're not contractors. They're not there voluntarily. The drizzle ticked against the stones. They're being held, she said. Yes. For how long? 8 months. She said nothing. The weight of 8 months sat between them on the wet mountain, and neither of them acknowledged it directly, because there was nothing to say about 8 months that made it smaller. Why tell me, she said finally. You're part of this network. I was, he said. Past tense. I ran the assessment on you because I was told to. The training base operation, I was told the risk to the cadets was negligible, and I accepted that assessment and I shouldn't have. He paused. Oh, say. 19, she said again. I know. His jaw was tight. There's a difference between what this started as and what it's become. I've been trying to find the line between those two things for about a year, and the training base was… He stopped. It was the line. I crossed it, and I knew it the moment the first IED went off, and I heard a 19-year-old screaming. She looked at him. This was not a performance. She was good enough at reading people in the dark to know that. It was the specific ugliness of a person confronting the gap between what they told themselves they were and what they'd actually done. You can give a full debrief to Kessler, she said. Everything. The network structure, the installation, the operations, the personnel, and the name of who helped them survive the dissolution review. If I do that, I'm finished. Yes. And the people in the installation. A federal team goes in, she said, with full authorization, clean chain of command. That takes time. It takes less time than it would have taken before tonight. He looked at the thermos, at the transmission equipment sitting unattended on the flat prominence, at the dark sky and the rain. The name, he said slowly, is someone you've met. She waited. The JAG officer at your debrief, he said. Tron. I was on the dissolution review panel 4.5 years ago. He was the one who ensured certain assets and infrastructure weren't fully documented. He looked at her directly. He's been on Iron Vale's staff for 14 months. That's not a coincidence. She brought him down off the mountain at 0130. Not under arrest. She didn't have that authority, and she wasn't going to pretend she did. He came voluntarily, which was something. He came with the thermos still in his hand, which was such a small human detail that she found it almost unbearable to look at. Kessler was in the Tactical Operations Center when they walked in. Her face when she saw Lena had a single beat of something that wasn't professional composure, which she corrected quickly. The two corner men moved forward on instinct. Kessler held up one hand and they stopped. Ms. Voss, she said. He's voluntary, Lena said. He has a full debrief for you. She paused. And you need to pull Tron, tonight, before he has access to any of what's happened in the last 6 hours. Kessler looked at her. Tran. The installation in the satellite image didn't survive the dissolution review by accident. He was on the review panel. She met Kessler's eyes. Pull him now, quietly. Don't let him know it's coming. A moment passed. Kessler turned to Arden and said something quietly. Arden left the room. Hale, standing near the communications board, said nothing, but she was looking at Lena with an expression that Lena hadn't seen on her face before. Not surprise exactly, but something close to the specific weight of understanding something fully that you'd previously only understood partially. Ridge, she still didn't have a name for him and didn't ask, sat down at the table with his thermos and looked at Kessler with the expression of someone who has decided the cost is worth it and is not going to second-guess the decision. The debrief lasted until 4 in the morning. Lena sat in for the first 2 hours, contributing specifics on the operation protocols and network architecture from her own knowledge. After that, she wasn't needed, and she knew it, and she removed herself to the corridor outside and sat on a bench and put her back against the wall and let herself be tired in the specific total way that she hadn't allowed herself to be tired since 0550 the previous morning. The corridor was empty. The drizzle had stopped sometime in the last hour and left behind a cold, clean silence. She sat with her hands in her lap and thought about 8 months. She thought about two people whose faces she knew in a high-altitude installation on a satellite image, and about the difference between a federal team going in with full authorization and someone going in tonight while the network didn't know their asset had turned. She knew which one was faster. She also knew she'd told herself she was done with faster, that faster was what hollow terrain had looked like, and she'd been right about the tactical logic of hollow terrain, and the three people who weren't with her anymore were still not with her. She sat with that for a while. At 4:20, Cross appeared at the end of the corridor. He looked like he hadn't slept, which tracked. He'd been in the interior barracks for 6 hours with minimal information and a phone he'd been told to keep off. He'd held to that, which told her something about him. He sat down on the far end of the bench. "Is it over?" he said. "Part of it." "Are you okay?" She looked at him. The question landed differently than she expected. Not as a pleasantry, but as something genuine, which she hadn't anticipated from him, and which she realized was no longer consistent with the person she'd watched him being over the past 12 hours. "I'm tired," she said. That was the honest answer. He nodded. "The threat. Against me. The person who made it is in that room right now giving a debrief to federal investigators." "Because you went and got him." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why? I mean, why you? Why come back into all of this for a job at a kitchen?" She looked at the opposite wall. It was a plain institutional surface, gray-painted concrete block, the kind of wall that existed purely as a wall and didn't pretend to be anything else. She'd spent 4 years in rooms with walls like this. "I needed somewhere ordinary," she said. "After hollow terrain, I needed to be around people who were doing honest, uncomplicated work, and who weren't going to ask me to be anything specific." She paused. "Kitchens are good for that. The work is clear. You either made the food or you didn't. It's either good or it isn't. There's no ambiguity in a kitchen." "But?" She turned to look at him. "But ordinary isn't the same as safe. I thought if I was quiet enough for long enough, the things I'd been part of would stop being relevant." She paused. "That was probably never going to be true. I just needed to believe it for a while." He sat with that. "The cadets," he said. "At the training base. We were completely unprepared for what happened. I was unprepared. I had the rank and the training scores, and I was useless. You held your people together in a structure under live fire without a working communications system," she said. "You maintained accountability, you coordinated the exit, and you were accurate in your debrief afterward, including about your own failures. That's not useless. It's not what you did. No, it's not what I did. But what I did took 17 operations to build, and it costs things that don't appear in any file." She looked at him directly. "What you did is what you had. The question is what you build from here." He was quiet again. This corridor was very still. "When this is over," he said carefully, "and whatever happens with the investigation and the installation and everything else, are you going to leave?" She thought about the satellite image. About 8 months. About a federal team going in with full authorization, which would take time she couldn't calculate from here. "I don't know yet," she said. It was the most honest thing she'd said to him, and he seemed to understand that because he nodded once and didn't push it. The door to the operations center opened and Kessler came out. She looked at Lena, then at Cross, then back at Lena. "We have enough for the federal warrant," she said. "The installation." She paused. "There's an entry window in approximately 31 hours based on weather patterns and the patrol schedule our source has provided. After that, the next window is 9 days out." Lena stood up. "The two people being held in the installation," she said, "are they confirmed alive as of the intelligence our source provided?" "As of 6 weeks ago," Kessler said carefully. "That's the most recent confirmed status." 6 weeks was a long time. She knew that. Kessler knew she knew it. 31 hours, Lena said. "Yes." "Tran?" "In custody as of 40 minutes ago. He doesn't know the scope of what we have yet." Lena nodded. She looked at the floor for a moment, at her boots, worn and wet from the mountain terrain. She thought about the kitchen, about Gerald Pruitt and his reading glasses and his golf handicap and the way the morning prep smelled at 5 o'clock. About the notebook in her quarters with its locked combination and its spare telegraphic lines. She thought about 2 people in 8 months. I'm going to need the satellite image, she said, and I'm going to need 40 minutes with your signals specialist to walk through the installation's communication protocols. She looked up at Kessler. After that, I want 4 hours of sleep. Real sleep, not the other kind. Kessler looked at her steadily. You understand this would be a fully authorized operation, clean chain of command, full federal backing, not like hollow terrain, Lena said. I know. And you still want to go in. She thought about what she'd told Cross, about what ordinary meant and what it cost to need it and what it cost to leave it. There's a difference, she said, between wanting to go in and knowing that going in is the right thing. She met Kessler's eyes. I know what the right thing is. I've known since I saw that image yesterday morning. She paused. That doesn't mean I want it. The corridor held the 4 a.m. silence. 4 hours, Kessler said finally. Then we plan. Lena picked up her duffel from the bench. Cross stood. She looked at him once, not to say anything specific, just to register the moment, because she'd learned to register moments since hollow terrain, since the specific cost of not paying attention to what was in front of you while it was still in front of you. Get some sleep, Captain, she said. You've had a long day. He almost smiled. It reached his eyes for the first time since she'd known him, which was not very long but felt, suddenly, longer than it was. She walked down the corridor toward her quarters. 4 hours. Then she was going back into the mountains. She slept for 3 hours and 40 minutes, which was close enough. The dreams were the kind she didn't remember clearly upon waking. Impressions more than images, the specific texture of cold stone and altitude, voices she knew without faces. She was used to that. She'd been used to it for 4 years. She lay still for the 30-second interval she always allowed herself, and then she got up, and she was already thinking about the installation's northeastern access point before her feet hit the floor. The planning session with Kessler and Arden ran from 0800 to 11:30. They worked from the topographic map, the satellite image, and the detailed debrief notes their source had provided overnight. She still didn't have a name for him and had stopped trying to get one. Given them everything: patrol rotation schedules, communication frequencies, structural layout of the installation's 4 main buildings, the location of the holding area within the second structure, the shift patterns of the personnel on site. 14 people in total, including the 2 being held. 12 network operators, varying in experience and armament. Lena listened to all of it, asked specific questions about the northeastern access route's coverage gaps, asked about the holding area's internal configuration, asked about the window timing twice to make sure she had the numbers exactly right. Then she sat back and looked at the map and said nothing for about 2 minutes while the room waited. I go in through the ravine on the eastern face, she said finally. Same terrain type as last night. I know how it moves. I establish overwatch on the high point above the installation. Here, she put her finger on the map, and I hold that position while the federal ground element comes through the northeastern access on my signal. The ground element is 8 people, Kessler said. 3 federal agents, 5 tactical support, not special operations. I know, which is why I hold the overwatch position until the installation's external security is neutralized. Then I transition to the northeastern corner of Structure 2 to secure the holding area before the ground element reaches it. That transition is 400 meters of open ground. 260, Lena said. The satellite image is at an angle. The actual distance is 260. She looked at Kessler. I walked it last night in my head. It works. Kessler looked at Arden. Arden, for the first time in Lena's experience, looked marginally uncertain. What if the patrol rotation is off, Kessler said. Then I adjust. What if the holding area has a guard inside rather than external? Then I deal with the guard inside. She met Kessler's eyes. I'm not going to tell you this has no variables. It has variables. All operations have variables. The question is whether the capability matches the risk, and I'm telling you it does. A silence. And the 2 people inside, Kessler said quietly. You know them. Yes. Is that going to be a problem? Lena thought about the honest answer to that question. It was complicated, and it was also, underneath the complication, very simple. It's going to be a reason, she said. That's not the same thing. She left the main campus at 1300, alone. In a vehicle, she drove herself to the trailhead at the Eastern Mountain Approach. Kessler's ground element was staging at a separate point, 3 kilometers north, on a timeline calibrated to arrive at the northeastern axis 40 minutes after Lena's estimated overwatch establishment. The drive took 25 minutes. She spent most of it not thinking about what was ahead, and thinking instead about the morning kitchen prep she was missing, which was a coping mechanism she'd developed years ago and still found quietly effective. Ordinary things as ballast, vegetable prep, oven calibration, the specific weight of a full sheet tray. She parked and got out and stood at the trailhead for a moment, looking up at the eastern face. The weather had cleared overnight, thin sun on gray rock, wind moving in the upper elevation, the kind of cold that was honest about itself. No pretense of warmth in it. She shouldered the pack and started climbing. The eastern face was harder than the night before because she was moving faster and carrying more weight, and the sun was at an angle that made the rock surfaces deceptive in ways darkness wasn't. She took one bad step at the 2/3 point and caught herself on her left hand, which scraped the heel open on the stone, and she held still for 10 seconds with the specific controlled irritation of someone who knows that self-recrimination is a luxury they don't have time for and makes the decision not to spend it. She crested the ridge at 1440, which was 8 minutes ahead of her estimated timeline. The installation was below and northwest, partially visible through the tree cover, exactly as the satellite image had shown. The cluster of 4 prefab structures, the vehicle access road from the north, the perimeter marked by a single-wire fence line that was more deterrence than barrier. She could see 2 external security personnel from the overwatch position, moving on a pattern consistent with what the debrief had described. She settled in behind a flat-topped rock outcropping and took out the optic. Through the monocular, the installation came into focus with the specific clinical clarity of magnification. Distances compressed, detail sharpened. She ran a systematic scan, left to right, near to far, building the picture methodically before she let herself look at Structure 2. When she looked at Structure 2, she looked at it professionally, not at what it contained, at its exterior dimensions, its entry points, the sightline from the northwestern corner to the overwatch position she occupied, the gap between Structure 2 and Structure 3 that the patrol path avoided. She noted everything. Then she lowered the optic and focused on the external security rotation for the next 22 minutes, confirming the patrol timing from the debrief against actual movement. It was off by about 90 seconds. The northern patrol ran slightly long, probably because the terrain on the north wire was rougher and slowed the pace. She filed the adjustment. At 15:32, she keyed the radio. Overwatch established. Confirm ground element status. Kessler's voice, steady and immediate. Ground element is at staging, on schedule. 40 minutes to northeastern access on your mark. Patrol timing runs 90 seconds long on the north route. Adjust your window accordingly. Copy. I'll call the transition. Don't move to Structure 2 before I signal. Understood. Voss? A pause. Everything looks good from your position? She looked at the installation below. At the 2 external security personnel moving their rotation with no awareness that they were being watched. At the thin winter sunlight on the prefab rooftops. Everything looks good, she said. She put the radio down and picked up the optic. The entry window opened at 1614. The northern patrol was at its farthest point from Structure 2. The southern patrol had just completed a circuit and was stationary at the vehicle access gate, attention oriented outward toward the access road rather than the interior. The gap between those 2 positions created a corridor of reduced observation that ran from the eastern perimeter wire to the northeastern corner of Structure 2. 260 meters. Based on her current read of conditions, she had approximately 3.5 minutes before the corridor closed. She didn't radio the ground element. The ground element was still 12 minutes from the northeastern access. She wasn't supposed to make the transition yet. She looked at the corridor for about 4 seconds. Then she went. She moved fast and low and used the natural contour of the terrain for cover where it existed and crossed open ground where it didn't. At the 100-meter mark, she made herself slow to a controlled pace rather than a sprint, because the last thing she needed was to arrive at the Structure 2 entrance breathing too hard to function immediately. She hit the northeastern corner at 2 minutes 55 seconds. She pressed against the wall and listened. Inside, movement. Single person. Footsteps at an interval that suggested someone sitting down and periodically standing, the pattern of a guard who had been in one place for too long and was managing boredom. She checked the entry point, a standard prefab door, outward swinging, key lock, and a slide bolt. The slide bolt was not thrown. She could see the gap at the frame. She gave herself 3 seconds, then she opened the door. The guard was a man in his 30s, sitting on an overturned crate with a magazine on his knee, and he had about 1 second of processing time before she closed the distance. She hit the magazine first, not a tactic, just what her hand found, which was absurd and also effective because it disrupted his visual field at the exact moment his hands were trying to do 3 things at once. She had him down and restrained with his own zip ties from his vest pocket in the time it took her breathing to complete 1 full cycle. He was alive, unhurt except for a bruised ego and a confiscated sidearm, which was sitting against the far wall where she'd placed it. She looked at the interior of the structure. It was a single open space divided by a plywood partition wall. On the other side of the partition were 2 people. She heard one of them shift before she got to the partition door. She opened it. The 2 people were Nate Okafor and Priya Selvin, and they'd been in this room for 8 months, and Lena had not seen either of them since the debrief following an operation they'd run together 5.5 years ago, and the last time she'd seen them alive, they'd been walking away from a situation that had cost other people everything, and she had spent 4 years believing they were dead. She stood in the doorway. Nate Okafor looked up from the floor where he'd been sitting with his back to the wall. He was thinner than she remembered, and there was a poorly healed cut along his left jawline that told its own story. His eyes moved from the door to her face and stayed there. He said, "Voss?" Just that. Priya Selvin was on her feet before the word finished, with the instinct of someone who had spent 8 months ready to move the moment anything changed. She was in worse shape than Nate visually, thinner, left arm held at a slightly wrong angle that suggested a fracture that had been set badly or not set at all. But her eyes were clear and very focused. Lena looked at them both for a moment that she allowed herself to be a moment rather than a professional interval. "Hey," she said. Her voice came out level, which cost something. "How did you find us?" Priya said. "Long story. Can you both walk?" "Yes," Nate said. He was already getting to his feet, slowly, with the deliberate care of someone managing chronic pain. Priya's arm. "I can walk," Priya said, with a sharpness that sounded like herself. And that was the most reassuring thing Lena had heard in several days. Lena keyed the radio. "Structure 2 is secure. 2 individuals ambulatory. I need the ground element at the northeastern access now." Kessler. "Ground element is 2 minutes out. Confirm no hostile contact inside?" "1 secured individual, non-combative. External security is still on rotation. Move fast." "Copy. Moving." She looked at Nate, at Priya, at the room they'd been in for 8 months, which was a standard prefab interior with 2 cots and a chemical toilet and a single bare bulb and walls that had marks on them she didn't look at directly. "When we move," she said, "we move fast and we move quiet until we're past the northeastern access wire. After that, federal support takes over and you're both in medical within the hour." She paused. "Questions?" "How many are outside?" Nate asked. 11. "The ground element will handle the exterior. I need you both focused on moving, not on what's happening outside. Can you do that?" "Yes," Priya said. "I left the guard in the front room zip-tied. He's not going anywhere, but he may make noise. We need to be out before that becomes a problem." She looked at them both one more time. "Stay behind me. Don't stop moving regardless of what you hear. If you go down, call it immediately and I will come back for you." Nate said, "Voss?" "Yeah." "You should know. The network. They knew you were at Iron Vale. They've known for weeks. Someone told them specifically." "Tran," she said. "I know. He's in federal custody." Something moved in Nate's face, relief but complicated, the kind that comes with 4 years of a question being answered and the answer being both better and worse than you'd imagined. "Let's go," she said. The exterior was not clean. It wasn't supposed to be clean. It was 12 network operators against 8 federal personnel, and Lena providing overwatch from ground level while simultaneously moving 2 compromised individuals toward the northeastern access wire, and the variables she'd acknowledged to Kessler in the planning session materialized in real time with the specific and different creativity of actual operations versus planned ones. The Northern Patrol came around 3 minutes early. That was the first variable. He came around the northeastern corner of Structure 3 at the same moment Lena was moving Nate and Priya along the eastern wall of Structure 2, and she had about a second and a half to make a decision about how to handle the intersection of those two facts. She went left, pushed Nate and Priya flat against the wall, and put herself between them and the patrol's sightline. The patrol passed 4 meters from them. He was looking at his radio, which someone had keyed on the federal channel, Kessler's People, making contact with the other external security on the south side, and the sound was pulling his attention west. He kept walking. Lena let out a breath. "Move," she said quietly, and they moved. The second variable was Priya's arm, which gave out when she tried to manage a low-wire crossing at the northeastern fence line, and she went down on her right knee with a sound she tried to suppress and didn't entirely succeed. Lena had her up and through the wire in the same motion. It wasn't elegant. Priya's jacket caught on the wire and tore, and Nate went through sideways at an angle that wouldn't be comfortable to review later. But they were through, and the federal tactical support element was 30 meters ahead at the access point, 2 of them moving forward to take Nate and Priya as Lena cleared the wire herself. She turned and looked back at the installation. From the sounds, controlled, organized, the specific acoustic signature of a professional operation rather than a firefight, Kessler's ground element had the exterior security contained. No shooting. That was the right outcome. That was what the 31-hour window and the patrol timing and the ground element's tactical preparation was supposed to produce. It had produced it. Not cleanly, but it had produced it. She stood at the northeastern wire and watched until she could see through the gaps in the fence that the installation's exterior was fully controlled, and then she turned and followed Nate and Priya toward the access road. The medical evaluation happened at the main campus, in the Academy's medical facility, beginning at 1800 and running past midnight. Priya's arm was a 3-month-old fracture that had been set badly and would need surgical correction. Nate had a list of things that the medical officer read out, with the careful neutrality of someone who has learned to deliver difficult information without editorializing, and Lena sat in the corridor outside and listened to the list, and did not editorialize either. Kessler found her there at 2100. She sat down beside her without preamble, which Lena had come to recognize as Kessler's natural mode, the absence of performance, of setup, of professional buffer. "All 12 network operators are in federal custody," she said. "No fatalities. 2 injuries, both on their side, neither critical." She paused. "The installation's operational records were intact. We have documentation going back 31 months, the full scope of what they were running." Another pause. "It's significant." "I know," Lena said. "The 2 people from your previous operation, Okafor and Selvan. They were taken 8 months ago because the network learned they'd been making contact with a federal investigator independently, trying to surface information about the remnant network's operations." She looked at the corridor floor. "They were held as leverage and as a warning to anyone else who might be considering the same." Lena said nothing. "The fact that they're alive is—" Kessler stopped. "I've been doing this work for 14 years. People held that long by that kind of operation don't usually come out of it the way they came out of that room tonight." She looked at Lena. "That's because of them, not us. I want to be clear about that." "I know," Lena said. "I know exactly what they're made of." Kessler was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your role in the last 48 hours, the overwatch at the training base, the ridge contact, the installation entry and extraction. There's going to be a full federal review. Your name is going to be on a lot of documents." "I know." "Your classified file is going to be reopened, updated. There are people above my level who are going to want to talk to you about what comes next." "I know that too." "And?" Lena looked at the door of the medical facility. Through the narrow window in the door, she could see the edge of a cot, a IV stand, the corner of a white blanket. "I'm going to talk to them," she said. "I'm going to give them everything they need for the review and the prosecution and whatever comes after." She paused. "And then I'm going to ask them a question." "What question?" "Whether what I did for 17 operations and what happened at Hollow Terrain and what it cost. Whether there's a way to use what's left of me that doesn't require me to disappear." She stopped. "I've been disappearing for 4 years. I'm good at it. But I'm not sure it's working anymore. Kessler looked at her for a long moment. What would not disappearing look like? Lena thought about that. It was a genuine question, and it deserved a genuine answer, and she wasn't sure she had the full answer yet, but she had the beginning of one. Iron Veil, she said. There are cadets here who have the rank and the scores, and no idea what they actually don't know yet. There are training programs with documentation errors and antenna brackets installed backward in patrol schedules that drift 90 seconds off timeline without anyone catching it. She paused. There are things I know how to see that most people here have never been taught to look for. Kessler said carefully, You're talking about staying. I'm talking about being useful in a way that doesn't require me to be invisible. She turned and looked at Kessler directly. I spent 17 operations being Ghost Widow. That's not who I want to be anymore. But I spent the last 7 weeks being the kitchen worker, and that's not all of it either. She stopped. I want to be Lena Voss. I want to figure out what that actually means. The formal review took 3 weeks. Lena spent most of it at Iron Veil, available for the investigators when they needed her, and in the hours when they didn't, doing what she'd been contracted to do. She was in the kitchen at 5 in the morning, and she prepped breakfast, and she ran dinner service, and she kept her station clean. Gerald Pruitt, who had returned fully from his chest cold and had clearly decided the best way to manage the recent events was to pretend they hadn't happened, made her coffee every morning, and didn't ask questions, which was a kindness she had never specifically requested and found that she needed. Cross was different. Not dramatically. Not in the performed way of someone who has decided to be different, but in the small, observable ways that actual change looks like. He included Whitfield in briefings he previously ran solo. He asked questions before issuing assessments. He sat with his back to the room sometimes, rather than always positioning himself at the head of the table. He came into the kitchen twice during those 3 weeks, not to talk about anything significant, just to get coffee and stand in the doorway for a few minutes in a way that communicated something without requiring him to say it. The third time he came in, he said, I want to ask you something. Go ahead, she said, without stopping what she was doing. Did you know, when you came to Iron Veil, that it was going to turn into this? She set down the knife, turned and looked at him. No, she said. I came for the ordinary work. I came because I needed something that didn't ask anything of me. She paused. I didn't come expecting any of this, but I should have known. Some things follow you because they're not finished yet, regardless of whether you feel like finishing them. He nodded slowly. And now? He said. She looked around the kitchen, at the industrial equipment and the prep surfaces and the stack of clean sheet trays and the small window above the sink that looked out over the academy's north courtyard, where cadets were currently running a morning physical training rotation. She could hear their cadence calls, muffled through the glass. Now I'm going to finish service, she said. And after that, I'm going to a meeting with 2 people from federal oversight who want to talk to me about a training and assessment role here. She picked up the knife. And after that, I'm going to call Priya Selvan and make sure she's eating enough. Cross almost smiled. Is she? Almost certainly not. She's stubborn about it. Sounds like someone else I know. She gave him a look. He raised his hand slightly and took his coffee and left. The meeting with federal oversight produced, after considerable deliberation and one significant argument about clearance levels that Lena won by the simple method of being more specific about the regulatory language than the person arguing the other side, an agreement. She would remain at Iron Veil in a formal advisory capacity, tactical assessment, and training vulnerability analysis, while retaining her kitchen assignment, because she'd asked for that specifically, and the oversight representative had looked at her like she was unusual, and she'd looked back like she didn't care. The agreement included a full declassification of her operational record, not for public access, but for institutional record, so that the work existed somewhere in a way that acknowledged it had happened. Hollow terrain included. The 3 people who hadn't come back, named, recorded, properly documented as what they were. She'd sat in that meeting and listened to the representative read the summary of hollow terrain into the record, the names of the 3 members of her element who had been killed in action on a classified operation that didn't formally exist, and she had kept her hands flat on the table and her face steady, and she had let the names be names in a room with other people present, which was something she hadn't allowed to happen before. It was not easy. It was the right thing. Those were, again, not the same. Nate Okafor came to Ironvale in the 5th week, when he was cleared for travel. He looked better, still too thin, still moving carefully, but his eyes were the same as they'd always been, observant and slightly amused by most situations in a way that hadn't changed since she'd first worked alongside him 7 years ago. She met him at the main gate. They stood in the parking area for a moment in the way that people stand when the situation is too large for immediate conversation and both of them know it. "You look like a kitchen worker," he said, looking at her jacket. "I am a kitchen worker. You're also apparently now an official tactical assessment advisor. Starting next month. 2 jobs. The kitchen job is better," she said. "Fewer meetings." He laughed. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh in a context that wasn't strained or performance. It sounded exactly the same as it always had. They walked across the campus to the dining hall, where she made him eat something, and then they sat with coffee for a long time while the academy moved around them. Cadets in transit between training blocks, staff crossing the courtyard, the ordinary institutional motion of a place that ran on schedule and purpose. "Priya is going to be fine," he said. "The surgery went well. She'll be back to full range of motion in 4 to 5 months." "I know, she told me." She also complained about the physical therapy. She's going to complain about the physical therapy until it's over, and then she's going to pretend it was never that bad. Also, yes. They sat with that for a moment. 8 months, he said. Not as a complaint or as an accusation, just as a fact that needed to be placed on the table. 8 months, she said. They told us about 3 months in that Ghost Widow was inactive, retired, gone. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. That was supposed to make us feel like there was no point holding out. Did it work? For about a week. He glanced at her. And then Priya said that if you were retired in a kitchen somewhere, you were still the most dangerous person in whatever kitchen you were in, and that eventually the situation would get loud enough that you'd hear it. He paused. She was right. She usually is, Lena said. She was also the one who said we should keep the communication attempts going, even when it seemed pointless. That someone would eventually pick up the thread. He set down the cup. She kept us going. I want you to know that. I don't want the story to be that you came in and extracted us. The story is that she kept us alive long enough for you to have someone to extract. Lena looked at him. That's the story I'll tell, she said. He nodded. Outside the dining hall window, a group of cadets was crossing the courtyard in the gray afternoon light, moving at the brisk, purposeful pace of people with somewhere to be. One of them, Lena recognized the gate before the face, was Cross, walking with Whitfield, and they were deep in what looked like an actual conversation rather than a briefing, Whitfield talking and Cross listening with his full attention in a way that would not have been visible on him 2 weeks ago. She watched them cross the courtyard and disappear around the corner of the stone building. You're staying, Nate said. Not a question. For a while. Because of them? She thought about that. About the cadets and the antenna bracket and the patrol timings and the notebook in her quarters that had a new entry dated 3 days ago. Not telegraphic this time, not spare. An actual account of the past 2 weeks, written in full sentences, the first time she'd done that in 4 years. Because I found out, she said slowly, that there's a version of useful that doesn't require me to be invisible. I'm still figuring out what that looks like. She picked up her coffee. But I'm not done figuring it out yet. In the weeks that followed, the prosecution of the Remnant Network's 12 captured operators moved forward through federal channels with the methodical, unglamorous momentum of institutional accountability. Tran faced a separate proceeding. Obstruction, conspiracy, violations of his disclosure obligations during the dissolution review, and the evidence from the installation's operational records was extensive enough that his legal representation reportedly advised him, within the first week of discovery, that a plea negotiation was his most realistic option. The Academy displayed nothing in Lena's honor. She hadn't asked for anything and wouldn't have accepted it. What changed was smaller than a display and more durable. The training documentation at the remote base was revised. Accurate standoff distances, properly installed communications equipment, fuel levels logged and checked on a standard rotation. The external sensor coverage gaps were addressed. The patrol timing variance on the north route was corrected, and then, on Lena's suggestion, deliberately varied rather than fixed, because a predictable patrol was a compromised patrol, regardless of how accurate it was. She ran the first vulnerability assessment of the training base in the third week of her advisory role, with 3 senior instructors and 4 third-year cadets in attendance. She walked them through the antenna bracket, the fuel level, the field map errors. She showed them how each small failure connected to the larger one, not as a lecture but as a walkthrough, crouching in the dirt of the supply room, pulling out the original inventory forms, letting the evidence explain itself. Cross was one of the 4 cadets. At the end of the walkthrough, standing outside in the cold mountain air, he said, "You saw all of this the first day." "Most of it," she said. "The antenna I caught on day 2. "And you stayed." "I submitted an inventory report," she said. "And I stayed." He was quiet for a moment. "If you'd left, if you'd decided it wasn't your problem." She looked at the training base around them, the repaired fence, the corrected antenna, the prefab structures that still showed the pockmarks from the shrapnel, which hadn't been patched because she'd recommended leaving them as they were, as a reference point. "Someone would have caught it eventually," she said. "Maybe." "But you caught it," he said, "because you were paying attention when it wasn't your job to pay attention." She looked at him. He was going to be a good commander, not because of the scores or the family name or the natural confidence he'd been born with, because he was in the process, right now, of becoming the kind of person who understood what he didn't know, which was a harder piece of work than anything on any assessment rubric. "That's the thing about paying attention," she said. "It doesn't care whether it's your job or not. You either do it or you don't." He nodded once. She turned and walked back toward the vehicle. The mountain ridges were gray-green in the afternoon light, the same as they'd been every day she'd been here, solid and old and completely indifferent to everything that had happened beneath them. She found that steadying rather than bleak, which she recognized as a change from how she'd found it 4 years ago. She had work to do. Dinner service at 6. A vulnerability report to finish before the end of the week. A phone call to Priya Selvin that she'd been putting off because Priya would want a full account, and full accounts took energy that she was managing carefully and consciously these days. She had, she thought, an accurate picture of what Lena Voss was. Not ghost widow, not the kitchen worker, not the sum of 17 operations or 4 years of deliberate disappearance, but the person who remained when all of that was accounted for. Imperfect, capable, carrying things she wasn't finished carrying and not pretending otherwise. That was enough to work with. That was, she thought, exactly enough. The most dangerous thing you can do is decide someone doesn't matter before you've bothered to find out who they are, because the person you dismissed today might be the one who decides